Adoptive parents? Has your kid ever crashed out? I was at our son Kian's birthday dinner at this all-you-can-eat sushi place he'd wanted to try for months when he dropped the bomb on me and my wife. I found my birth parents, Derek and Crystal Sanders. They want to meet me. My wife Rosie smiled. That's wonderful, honey. We always said we'd support you if... I'm moving in with them after I turn 18, Kian interrupted. They're my real parents. You guys are just placeholders. The chopsticks slipped from my hand. We'd adopted Kian when he was 6, raised him for 10 years. Kian, what are you talking about? Rosie's voice cracked. You're not my real parents, he said, not even looking up from his sushi. I've been thinking about it. You're just strangers who the state assigned to raise me. Derek and Crystal, they're my blood, my actual family. They made me and I owe them everything. I don't owe you anything. Not love, not respect, nothing. Rosie started crying. But we love you. That's your choice. I never asked for it. You're not my real mom and dad. You're just nobody's I got stuck with. I took my wife's hand and spoke. Okay, Kian. If we're strangers, then we'll be strangers. Rosie looked at me shocked, but I smiled at her. And Kian laughed. Glad you get it. I'm meeting my real parents tomorrow. Fine, I responded. But strangers don't live here for free. Rent's $500 a month, due immediately. The next morning, Kian needed a ride to meet Derek and Crystal. Dad, can you... I'm not your dad, and I don't drive strangers around. It's 2 hours away. Not my problem. He took an Uber which cost him $120 from his college savings. When he got back, he was glowing. Derek played football. Crystal's an artist. They said I have their genes, their talents. They get me. Cool. Where's your rent? What? You said we're strangers. Strangers pay rent. $500. I don't have $500. Better get a job then. Also, you need to buy your own food now. Strangers don't share groceries. Kian had a basketball tournament that weekend. College scouts were coming. Can you drive me to the tournament? Why would I drive a stranger to basketball? You've driven me for 10 years. That was when you were my son. Now you're just a tenant. Take the bus. He missed warm-ups. Coach benched him. Scouts left at halftime. His college applications were due in 2 weeks. He needed parent recommendation letters. Can you write my parent recommendation? I'm not your parent. Ask Derek and Crystal. They don't know me. Not my problem. They're your real parents. Derek and Crystal couldn't write anything substantial. They didn't know his grades, his activities, nothing. The guidance counselor called, confused. Kian's parents haven't submitted recommendations? We're not his parents, I explained. He made that very clear. He said we're strangers. His real parents are Derek and Crystal Sanders. When Kian got strep throat, he needed antibiotics. Can you take me to urgent care? I don't take strangers to doctors. Besides, I removed you from my insurance. You're Derek and Crystal's responsibility. What? Strangers don't share health insurance. The visit would cost $300 without insurance. Derek and Crystal didn't answer their phones for 3 days. His National Honor Society induction required parent attendance. Rosie and I didn't go. We're not your parents, Rosie reminded him. Derek and Crystal promised to come. They never showed. Kian stood alone while every other kid had family there. The advisor whispered, Where are your parents? Getting high, probably. Kian mumbled. Prom was coming. Kian needed $300 for tickets, tux rental, dinner. Can I borrow? I don't lend money to strangers, I said. Especially strangers who made it clear they owe me nothing. He didn't go to prom, sat home looking at Instagram photos of his teammates. His college fund, $80,000 we'd saved since he was 7, remained locked. That money was for our son, I explained. You're not our son. You're Derek and Crystal's son. They don't have any money. Not our problem. We're just strangers, remember? What finally made Kian snap was when he got appendicitis. Called me from school, crying in pain. Please, Dad, I need to go to the hospital. I'm not your dad, and I don't take strangers to hospitals. Call your real parents. Derek was high. Crystal didn't have a car. Kian called an ambulance. $3,000 bill. Hospital called us as emergency contacts. We're not his parents, I told them. He made that clear. Bill Derek and Crystal Sanders. Kian had to drop out of school to work full-time at McDonald's to pay medical bills. No insurance, no college, no basketball. Derek and Crystal disappeared after asking him for money. When Kian came home sobbing, begging us to be his parents again, I looked at him calmly. But Kian, we're just strangers. You said so yourself. We're placeholders. Why would strangers take you back? I was wrong. Please, you're my real parents. You raised me. No, Kian. You made it very clear. We're just people the state paid to house you. And since you're 17 now, the state stopped paying. You need to leave by Friday. Where will I go? Ask your real parents. Oh, wait. Derek's in jail for meth and Crystal's in rehab. Again. He stood there, 17 years old, no diploma, no college, no future, abandoned by the birth parents he chose over us. Please, Dad. I'm not your dad. You explained that to me very clearly. While we were eating sushi, remember? You said you owed us nothing. No love, no respect, nothing. So that's what you're getting. Nothing. He stared at me in disbelief. That's it. I'm not taking this anymore. He went upstairs without a word. I heard the water running for an hour. Then another 30 minutes later, sirens outside our door. The paramedics rushed through our front door with their equipment, and I pointed upstairs without even thinking about it. They took the stairs 2 at a time while Rosie ran after them, screaming Kian's name over and over. I stood frozen in the hallway, hearing them break down the bathroom door, and then all this shouting and movement above me. My legs wouldn't move, even when I heard them counting compressions. The EMT came halfway down the stairs and asked if we were coming to the hospital, and I heard myself say yes, even though my brain hadn't processed what was happening yet. They carried Kian out on a stretcher with an oxygen mask on his face and tubes everywhere, and Rosie grabbed his hand, but they made her let go so they could load him in the ambulance. We followed in our car, and Rosie couldn't stop shaking the whole drive there. At the ER, they took him straight back while we got stuck at the registration desk. The woman asked about insurance, and I told her Kian wasn't on our policy anymore because he said we weren't his real parents. She looked up from her computer screen and asked me to repeat that. I explained the whole stranger situation while Rosie started sobbing next to me. The registration lady gave me this look I'll never forget, like she was seeing some kind of monster. She said we'd need to figure out the financial stuff later and sent us to the waiting room. 3 hours passed before anyone talked to us. A nurse finally came out and asked about Kian's medical history, any medications he was on, previous mental health issues. I started explaining about the adoption and how he'd been doing fine until he found his birth parents, but Rosie cut me off and gave the actual medical information they needed. The nurse wrote everything down without making eye contact with me. Another hour passed before the psychiatric intake nurse came to explain what would happen next. She said Kian would be on a mandatory 72-hour hold after what he did. She asked about our family dynamics, and I got defensive, explaining how Kian had rejected us first, how he'd called us strangers and placeholders. The nurse kept writing notes while I talked, and I could feel something shifting in my chest, like anger giving way to something else I didn't want to name. She said someone would update us tomorrow about visiting hours, and left us sitting there. We drove home in silence, and neither of us slept that night. The next morning, Rosie got up early to go visit Kian in the psych ward, but I couldn't make myself go. I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and staring at nothing while she was gone. She came home 3 hours later and wouldn't look at me. She went straight upstairs and I heard the bedroom door close. The distance between us felt bigger than just the stairs and hallway. That afternoon, the hospital social worker called to say they were filing a CPS report for possible neglect. I got furious and started arguing that Kian was 17 and had chosen this path himself when he was rejected us for his birth parents. The social worker stayed calm and said they had to follow protocol given the circumstances. My hands were shaking when I hung up the phone. I walked around the empty house for a while and ended up standing in Kian's room. His basketball trophies lined the shelves, and there were photos everywhere from over the years. One caught my eye from when he was 8, and I was teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway. He had this huge smile, and his arms were raised in victory because he'd just made it to the mailbox without falling. I remembered running behind him that day, ready to catch him if he wobbled. I forced myself to leave the room and locked the door behind me. 3 days after the incident, Raphael Chandler from CPS showed up at our door for the first home visit. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with a clipboard and a tired expression. He explained that we were still legally responsible for Kian until he turned 18, regardless of what he'd said about us not being his real parents. He listed all the things we were required to provide, including food, shelter, medical care, education support. I wanted to argue, but Rosie invited him in and offered him coffee. He walked through the house, taking notes and asking questions about our daily routines and Kian's needs. The discharge planning meeting happened 5 days after Kian went in. Both parents had to attend and sign a safety plan before he could come home. The conference room at the hospital was small and crowded with the psychiatrist, social worker, discharge planner, and Raphael from CPS. They went through medication schedules and follow-up appointments and therapy requirements. Rosie handled everything, asking questions and taking notes while I sat there signing papers like they were business contracts. I kept my face neutral the whole time, even when they talked about suicide precautions and removing potentially dangerous items from the house. Kian came home the next day under the safety plan requirements. We could barely look at each other when Raphael brought him to the door. The plan said someone had to lock up his medications and give them to him at scheduled times. He needed rides to therapy appointments 3 times a week. The awkwardness was constant, passing each other in the hallway without speaking, sitting at opposite ends of the dinner table, the sound of his door closing whenever I walked by. 2 weeks later, the school called about Kian missing so much class that he might not graduate. They wanted a parent meeting to discuss options. I told myself this was just the consequence of his choices, that he'd brought this on himself when he chose Derek and Crystal over us. Michaela French showed up at our door 3 days later with a folder full of papers and a look that said she wasn't taking no for an answer. She spread out forms for accommodations and makeup work on our kitchen table while explaining how Kian could still salvage his senior year if we all worked together. The papers needed parent signatures on every page, and I pushed them away without even reading them. Rosie waited until I left the room, then grabbed the pen and signed everything herself, while Michaela pretended not to notice the tension. Later that week, Raphael called with news that made my stomach turn, even though part of me felt satisfied. Derek Sanders had been arrested again for possession, with intent to distribute, and was looking at serious prison time this time. Crystal had checked herself back into the same rehab facility she'd left 6 months ago after overdosing in a parking lot. Raphael said Kian found out through social media when one of Derek's friends posted about the arrest, and he hadn't eaten anything for 2 days after that. I watched him push food around his plate at dinner and lose more weight, but told myself this proved I was right about his birth parents all along. Raphael's next call was less optional when he said we had to attend mandatory parenting classes starting next week, or he'd have to escalate our case to his supervisor. My pride wanted to fight him on it, but the fear of actual legal consequences made me agree to show up. The classes were held in a community center basement that smelled like old coffee and disappointment. Meanwhile, Rosie had found an outpatient therapy program with someone named Tyson Ellis, who specialized in adoption trauma and family crisis. She enrolled Kian without asking me, and then had the nerve to suggest I join them for family sessions. I told her I wasn't interested in therapy with a stranger, since that's what Kian had made clear we were to him. She just looked at me with this tired expression and said she'd go alone if she had to. Kian's first solo session with Tyson lasted exactly 1 hour, but apparently he spent the entire time talking about our family and everything that had happened since his birthday dinner. Tyson called that evening requesting a family meeting to discuss treatment options and said it would really help if both parents could attend. I said I'd think about it, which we both knew meant no. The mail started getting worse when the bills from the ambulance and hospital began arriving with amounts that made my hands shake. The ambulance ride alone was $12,000, and the emergency room visit was another $8,000. The psychiatric ward stay came to $20,000 for just 1 week. Every envelope felt heavier than the last, and I found myself getting angry at everyone involved. Mad at the system for charging so much, mad at Kian for putting us in this position, mad at myself for letting it get this far. But mostly, I was starting to feel the actual weight of what I'd done pressing down on my chest when I looked at those numbers. 2 colleges that had been recruiting Kian for basketball sent official letters withdrawing their interest due to his academic situation and missed games. He sat at the kitchen table staring at the rejection emails on his laptop while tears rolled down his face. I stood in the doorway pretending to look for something in the cabinet so I wouldn't have to acknowledge what was happening. His dreams of playing college ball were dead, and we both knew it, but neither of us said anything. The McDonald's manager kept calling about schedule conflicts because Kian's therapy appointments were 3 times a week and always during peak hours. His safety plan required supervised medication times that didn't line up with his shifts, and he kept having to leave early or come in late. Every day turned into this complicated mess of trying to get him where he needed to be while maintaining the distance I'd created. Rosie handled most of it, but sometimes she had to work, and I'd have to drive him places in complete silence. We'd sit in the car not talking while the radio played songs we used to sing together. Michaela French called another meeting to propose something she called a credit recovery plan that could get Kian enough credits to graduate if we all cooperated. She laid out a schedule of online classes and tutoring sessions and makeup assignments that would require parent support and supervision. I told her Kian needed to apologize first before I'd help with anything, and she just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. She said this wasn't about our personal issues, but about a kid's future, and I said that kid had made his choice about who his real parents were. Michaela gathered her papers and left without another word, but Rosie followed her out to the car, and they talked for 20 minutes. The worst day came when Kian got permission to visit Crystal at her rehab facility 2 hours away. Rosie drove him there and waited in the parking lot while he went inside to see the woman he'd chosen over us. He came home 3 hours later, looking completely broken with red eyes and shaking hands. He went straight to his room without eating dinner, and I could hear him crying through the walls that night. The sound made something crack inside my chest, but I turned up the TV and pretended not to hear it. 3 days later, Raphael's supervisor called while I was eating breakfast. Selene Chandler's voice was sharp and left no room for argument when she told me the parenting classes weren't optional anymore. I showed up at the community center that Thursday night with my jaw clenched and arms crossed, counting down the 90 minutes until I could leave. The instructor started with a case study about an adoptive family where the teenager rejected his parents after finding his birth family. She described how the adoptive father responded by withdrawing all support and treating the kid like a stranger, creating a cycle of punishment that nearly destroyed everyone involved. I sat there feeling my face get hot as she talked about the damage this caused, the medical crisis that followed, and how the family ended up in the system. Everyone in the room was nodding and making sympathetic noises about how terrible that father was, and I wanted to stand up and explain that they didn't understand the whole story. Connor Mooney raised his hand and started talking about his own son, who went through an identity crisis at 16 after connecting with his birth mother online. He described the kid saying almost the exact same things Kian had said about real parents and strangers, and how it felt like getting stabbed in the chest. But then Connor talked about choosing to stay connected even when it hurt, about keeping the door open instead of slamming it shut, and how his son came back around after 6 months of confusion. Something shifted uncomfortably in my chest as he described holding steady through the rejection instead of matching it with more rejection. The drive home was silent, and Rosie was already in bed when I got there, but the next morning she was waiting for me in the kitchen with papers spread across the table. She told me she'd been looking at apartments, and if I didn't start trying to fix things with Kian, she was going to sign a lease and move out. Her hands were steady as she pointed to the rental listings and explained she couldn't watch me destroy our family anymore. I'd never seen her this serious about anything, and suddenly the idea of losing both of them became real in a way that made my stomach drop. That afternoon, I walked past Kian's room and saw him taking photos of his gaming console with his phone, posting it on some selling app with a price that was way too low for what it was worth. He was trying to scrape together $500 for the rent I'd demanded, selling the PlayStation we'd given him for Christmas 2 years ago, along with all his games. The regret hit me so hard I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself, watching him package up things he loved to pay the stranger prices I'd set. Later that week, the house phone rang, and I heard Kian pick it up in his room. Then Derek's voice came through asking for commissary money and making promises about getting out soon and being a real father. Derek went on about how the charges were bogus, and he'd be out in a few weeks, and they'd get a place together, just the two of them, like it should have been all along. My anger shifted completely in that moment from Kian to this man who'd filled our son's head with lies and then abandoned him when things got hard. The following Saturday night around 11, my phone rang with Kian's number, but I didn't pick up out of habit from all these weeks of treating him like a stranger. The phone rang 3 more times over the next hour, but I kept ignoring it, telling myself he could handle whatever it was on his own. Sunday morning, Rosie told me Kian's friend had overdosed at a party, and Kian had been the one to call 911 and do CPR until the paramedics arrived. He'd tried calling me for help when it was happening, but handled it alone when I didn't answer, and the shame of that kept me awake for the next 3 nights. Rosie scheduled an appointment with a family therapist named Valerie Potts and told me I was going whether I wanted to or not. I agreed to attend 1 session just to get her to stop threatening to leave, but we both knew that wasn't the only reason I was going. The first session was a disaster with everyone yelling over each other and Kian calling me a monster while I shouted back about respect and consequences. Rosie cried through most of it, and Valerie had to use this little bell thing to get us to stop talking over each other. She introduced this concept called rupture and repair, explaining how relationships break and can be fixed, but the fixing takes more work than the breaking. She gave us homework assignments, and mine was to write a timeline of all the years I'd spent caring for Kian, starting from when we first brought him home. I sat at the kitchen table that night with a legal pad, writing about teaching him to ride his bike in the park and how he'd insisted on training wheels for 3 months longer than he needed them. I wrote about staying up all night when he had the flu at 8 years old, bringing him popsicles and reading him stories until his fever broke. I wrote about driving to every basketball practice and game, cheering from the stands even when he was on the bench, telling him he'd played great even when he'd barely touched the ball. As I filled page after page with memories of birthday parties and homework help and bedtime stories, my defenses started cracking, and I had to stop writing several times to get myself together. That night, after finishing the timeline, I grabbed another piece of paper and started writing an apology letter to Kian. The words came out messy and crossed out and rewritten a dozen times. I wrote about how wrong I was, and how sorry I felt, and how much I wanted to fix things between us. I folded it up and put it in an envelope with his name on it. I walked to his door 3 different times that week but couldn't knock. The envelope sat in my desk drawer while I fought with myself about whether giving it to him would make things better or worse. Tuesday morning, the mail brought a letter from a collections agency about the ambulance bill from Kian's attempt. They threatened to garnish my wages if we didn't set up payment immediately. I called them and accepted responsibility for the full amount, even though it made me sick to see the numbers. The payment plan would take 2 years to pay off at $300 a month. I found Kian at the kitchen table Wednesday night with his laptop open to GED program websites. He was writing down costs and requirements in a notebook and trying to figure out bus routes on his phone. The testing fees were $200, and he needed transportation to the testing center 40 minutes away. He didn't ask me for help, and I didn't offer any. Thursday's parenting class came, and the instructor asked if anyone wanted to share their story. My hand went up before I could stop myself. I stood in front of 12 other parents and told them everything from the birthday dinner to the hospital to the CPS involvement. The words tasted bitter coming out, and several people looked shocked at what I'd done. One woman shook her head the whole time I talked. When I sat down, my face burned with shame, but something inside me felt lighter. Friday morning, Kian left dishes in the sink, and I started to say something sharp about responsibility. The words were right there ready to come out when I caught myself and took a deep breath instead. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen without saying anything. It was the first time I'd stopped myself from turning something small into a punishment. Raphael came for his monthly reassessment visit that afternoon and walked through the house taking notes. He commented that things seemed calmer and asked about our therapy progress. The case would stay open, but he reduced our required check-ins to once a month instead of twice. Saturday, one of Kian's old teammates called about a community basketball league at the rec center. Kian signed up and had his first game Sunday afternoon. I went and sat in the bleachers watching him play. He made 3 baskets and grabbed 5 rebounds and looked happy for the first time in months. I wanted to cheer but kept quiet and left without talking to him. Monday, Kian came home from work early because the medication made him dizzy and tired. His manager at McDonald's cut his hours from 30 to 20 a week, which meant less money but more time to rest. I felt frustrated watching him struggle with the side effects, but didn't say anything about it being his fault. Tuesday, Raphael called to tell me the eviction threats I'd made were illegal since Kian was still 17 and my dependent. He said I needed to formally tell Kian the rent requirement was canceled. I wrote a note saying he didn't owe rent anymore and left it on his bed. The embarrassment of being corrected burned in my chest. Wednesday, I had my first appointment with my own therapist that Rosie had found for me. The therapist asked me to explain the difference between boundaries and punishment. I couldn't answer at first because I'd convinced myself they were the same thing. She helped me see how I'd taken my hurt and turned it into a weapon against my own kid. She explained that boundaries protect yourself while punishment is meant to hurt others. We talked about how my need to be right had become more important than my love for Kian. She gave me homework to identify 3 times I'd chosen punishment over connection. Thursday morning, another bill came from the hospital for Kian's emergency room visit. Friday, Kian had another basketball game and scored 12 points. Saturday, we passed each other in the hallway 6 times without speaking. Sunday, Rosie made dinner for all 3 of us, and we ate in silence. Monday, the therapist asked me to practice 1 supportive action without expecting anything back. Tuesday, I left gas money on the kitchen counter when I saw Kian's tank was empty. Wednesday, Raphael called to schedule our next meeting. Thursday, Kian worked a double shift to make up for his reduced hours. Friday, I found myself standing outside his door with the apology letter again, but still couldn't give it to him. Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with an email from a coach at the local junior college asking if Kian was still interested in playing basketball. The coach said they had a spot on the team, but Kian would need his GED first and asked about his recovery timeline. I forwarded the email to Rosie and Kian without adding any comments. Kian came downstairs 20 minutes later, holding his phone and looking confused about why I'd sent it to him. I told him it was his choice what to do with the opportunity. He nodded and went back upstairs to research GED programs on his laptop. That afternoon, we had our second family therapy session with Valerie, and I brought the apology letter I'd been carrying around for weeks. My hands shook as I pulled it from my pocket and started reading about how I'd let my hurt turn into cruelty. I read about the bike rides and basketball games and homework help over the years. I told him I was wrong to weaponize being strangers against him. I said I understood if he couldn't forgive me, but I needed him to know I was sorry. Kian stared at the floor the whole time and didn't say anything when I finished. Rosie reached over and squeezed my hand while Valerie wrote notes on her clipboard. After the session, Rosie sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing out a family stabilization plan. She created columns for responsibilities and goals and timelines. She wrote down specific tasks like grocery shopping schedules and chore rotations and therapy appointments. She included financial stuff like canceling the rent demands and getting Kian back on our insurance. She made rules about respect and communication and second chances. She called a family meeting that night and went through each point while Kian and I listened. We all signed the bottom of the paper, even though trust was still broken between us. Monday morning, I called the insurance company and added Kian back to our policy. I threw away the rent invoices I'd been keeping in a folder. Rosie posted a chore chart on the fridge that gave everyone specific tasks without making it feel like punishment. The house felt less tense, even though we still barely talked to each other. Tuesday, I ran into our neighbor at the grocery store, and she asked how Kian was doing. Instead of making excuses or defending myself, I just said we were working through some challenges as a family. She nodded and didn't push for details, which I appreciated. Walking away from that conversation without needing to explain or justify felt strange, but also lighter somehow. Wednesday, Kian took his first GED practice test and scored high enough to schedule the real math exam. Thursday, he passed it with a score of 168. Rosie ordered pizza that night, and we ate together at the table for the first time in weeks. Kian actually smiled when we congratulated him, and that smile felt worth more than all my pride combined. Friday, a thick envelope arrived from the courthouse with Derek's sentencing information. Kian picked it up from the mail pile and looked at it for a few seconds before setting it aside unopened. I wanted to make a comment about his real father, but kept my mouth shut and went back to reading my book. Saturday afternoon, Rosie was folding laundry when her breathing got fast and shallow. She dropped the shirt she was holding and grabbed the edge of the dresser. Her face went pale, and she said she couldn't breathe right. Kian heard the panic in her voice and came running from his room. He helped her sit on the bed while I got a paper bag for her to breathe into. Kian rubbed her back and told her to count with him while I held the bag. We worked together without arguing or blaming for 10 whole minutes until her breathing went back to normal. She cried afterward, and we both hugged her, and nobody mentioned the months of stress that probably caused it. Monday, we drove to the high school for a meeting with Michaela French about Kian's education options. She had paperwork ready for us to officially withdraw him and transition to GED completion. She explained how the credits would transfer and what he'd need for junior college enrollment. We all sat there signing forms and accepting that this wasn't the graduation we'd planned, but it was the path forward we had now. Kian seemed relieved to be done with high school, even though it meant giving up senior year activities. Tuesday was Kian's first basketball game with the community league, and I offered to drive him. He looked surprised but grabbed his gear and got in the car. I turned on the radio to the classic rock station we used to listen to together. Neither of us talked during the 20-minute drive, but we weren't fighting either. We just existed in the same space listening to music without lectures or anger or demands. I dropped him off at the gym entrance and told him I'd pick him up after. He said thanks and actually meant it before jogging inside with his basketball shoes squeaking on the pavement. 3 days later, Kian came home with news about a job opening at the sporting goods store near the community center. The manager there knew him from basketball and offered him 20 hours a week with flexible scheduling around his therapy appointments. He filled out the application right there at the kitchen table while Rosie made dinner, and I pretended to read the newspaper. The next week, he started training on the register and learning about different equipment brands. His schedule worked better than McDonald's ever did because they understood he had medical stuff to deal with. I drove him to work twice when the bus was running late, and we didn't talk, but the radio played old songs we both knew. After 3 months of taking his meds every day and going to therapy twice a week, the house felt different. Not perfect or even good, really, but we weren't walking on eggshells anymore, waiting for the next crisis. Kian still had bad days where he'd stay in his room, but they happened less often. Rosie stopped jumping every time she heard a noise upstairs. I stopped checking his room when he was at work to make sure he was really gone. The therapist said this was our new normal, and we had to accept it might never be like before. In May, Kian took his last GED test at the community college testing center. We all went, even though he didn't ask us to come. He came out after 2 hours looking tired, but said he thought he did okay. 2 weeks later, the results came in the mail, and he'd passed everything. Rosie cried and hugged him while I stood there not sure what to do with my hands. The same day, a letter arrived from the junior college saying they'd accept him for fall semester with conditions about maintaining his grades and continuing treatment. We all stood in the kitchen passing the letter around like it was made of gold. Our last family therapy session with Valerie happened the week before Kian turned 18. She had us each write down what we wanted for the next year, and then we shared them out loud. Kian wanted to stay living at home while starting college if we'd let him. Rosie wanted family dinners 3 times a week. I wanted us to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. We spent an hour making agreements about chores and rent and rules that felt like actual planning instead of me just making demands. Valerie had us sign the paper like a contract and gave us each a copy. 2 days after the GED results came, Rosie organized a small dinner to celebrate. Just us and Kian's friend from basketball, who'd stuck around through everything. I gave Kian a binder I'd been working on for weeks with photos and ticket stubs and report cards from when he was little. Each page had dates and notes about things we'd done together, like when I taught him to ride a bike or when we built that treehouse that fell down after a week. He looked through it quietly and then said thanks without looking at me. That was enough. The basement had been storage for years, but Kian asked if he could move down there for more space. We spent a whole Saturday carrying boxes up to the attic and moving his bed and desk downstairs. I helped him run an extension cord for his computer, and we figured out how to make the small window open for air. We worked for 6 hours barely talking, except about where things should go or what tools we needed. When we finished, he had his own space that wasn't quite an apartment, but wasn't a kid's bedroom either. Rosie brought down sandwiches, and we ate them sitting on boxes looking at what we'd built together. That night, I sat at my computer trying to write an email to Raphael about how things were going for his final report. I kept starting and deleting sentences about being sorry or doing better. Finally, I just wrote that I understood now how my need for revenge almost killed my son, how I chose being right over being a father, how I turned legitimate hurt into weapons that destroyed everything we'd built over 10 years. We weren't fixed and might never be completely okay, but we were still here and still trying to be a family, even if it looked different from before. 2 weeks later, Raphael called to say the CPS case was officially closing. The hospital bills got put on a payment plan that would take 5 years to pay off, but at least they stopped calling every day. Kian started practicing with the junior college basketball team, even though he couldn't play official games until spring semester. I went to watch one practice and stood in the back where he couldn't see me. He looked good out there running drills and laughing with other players. Not the same as before when scouts were watching but still playing the game he loved. This wasn't the future any of us planned when we were eating sushi on his birthday. Back then, I thought we'd be visiting him at some Division I school on a full scholarship. Instead, we were rebuilding from ashes I created when I chose punishment over love. The scholarship money was gone, and the opportunities were smaller, but we were still here, and that had to count for something. Thanks for tagging along and wondering through all of this with me. It's been a pretty wild journey to share. I'll see you next time. Like the video, it helps more than you think.